Good morning. I'm happy to be with you today. I'm Dr. Michael Crowder. As Dr. Slonemsky has told you, I will be your guest video lecturer for today. I'm really happy to be here, at least through video, with you. I hope you're all well. I hope that we're all safely social distanced and quarantined. So today's topic is public history and commemoration. And Dr. Slonemsky, I know, asked you to read a speech that I gave in August of last year, 2019. So in advance, thank you for reading it. And I want to talk about some of the themes that are contained in that speech. But before I do that, I just want to lay out my plan for this 25-minute video lecture, and it is this. It is to first discuss a little bit about what public history is, the forms that it can take, and also provide you with a definition of what it means to practice public history. And then what I want to do is talk about two modern day examples of how practicing public history, and more importantly about how public history and commemorating past events continues to affect our lives today. And the two examples that I will supply are, one, the subject of the speech which you've read, the Battle of Brooklyn, a very important battle in the early stages of the American War for Independence in 1776. And before that, I want to talk about an example of public history and commemoration which really touches on a lot of many of the sort of modern day divisive hot-button issues, which is the Confederate monument controversy. So by the time you see this, you will have access to 3 slides of a PowerPoint presentation that I've already given Dr. Slonemsky. So what I'll do as I go through these topics, first public history and commemoration, and then the 2 examples that I just mentioned, I'm going to refer to the slides and refer to some of the images on them. So if you could please pull up the slides and have them at the ready while you're watching this, so that you can follow along with me as I refer to text and images. In here, I'm beginning with the first slide, which is entitled Considering Public History. What I want to do is just talk very quickly about what public history is and how it's practiced. So what you can see at this on this slide entitled Considering Public History is a brief definition of what public history is and the forms that it can take. And if you look at the first bullet point, the simple definition of public history, very broadly construed, is the practice of bringing historical knowledge to public spaces, bringing knowledge of past events, but also taking the scholarship of professional historians, which is sometimes can be a little bit daunting because it's often written for other history professionals, in a sense translating it into a manner which is meant to be framed for public consumption. And this begins to bleed into the second bullet point, making history accessible. It's how do we take the study of history, which certainly impacts everybody in our instance, American society, but the knowledge of history impacts the way that people across the world understand their national identities, their personal identities, their national and personal histories. How do we take that impressive body of scholarship that professional historians have spent quite a lot of time and emotional energy generating and translated for public audiences? And this can take several different forms, and I've listed here 3 forms on this slide, but there are many, many, many more than 3 forms that public history can take. In the broadest sense, public history is taking any body of historical knowledge, and the 2 examples, again, that I'll use today are the Civil War Confederate Monument controversy and Brooklyn's Battle Week. How do we take knowledge of past events and present it to modern day current audiences, contemporary audiences? So the three examples I list here, and again, this is nothing close to exhaustive, are familiar ones, I think, to many of us. Museum exhibitions, so taking historical items, curating exhibitions, and then presenting them to the public. So if you look to the bottom image on this slide called Considering Public History, you can see an example of that, and it happens to be an example of a museum exhibition, which I had a part in helping to create. So it's a small image, and so of course you can't read the text on the individual items, but what that is a display case of items that was part of an exhibition created for the ITPS, which undoubtedly you are familiar with by now, the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies October 2018 conference. And those particular items, which I know that you can't see, and here I am looking down at them, are texts written by or about the life of Thomas Paine from the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And so those texts, which you can see displayed in a case, and that is in Ryan Library, by the way, are very rare and valuable texts, which we, myself and a former ITPS fellow, curated and presented to the public. And so that's one way that public history operates. It's how do we take historical materials, physical objects, in this case, printed texts, and present them to the public in a way that will help the general audience understand their historical significance. The second form that I've listed here are public presentations. And so if you look at the two top images, but the image on the left, it says in red, save the date. That is another ITPS event that occurred in January 2020, even though if you look closely, that says January 2019. Actually, it was this past January, pre-coronavirus, of course. And that is an event that was held at the Thomas Paine Cottage, which is just less than a mile up North Avenue from the Iona campus. An invitation that the ITPS and the Thomas Paine Cottage extended to Dr. Emma Hart, if you can see the text, although it's a little bit small there, who came to New Rochelle from St. Andrews University in Scotland to talk about her book, her recent book called Trading Spaces, which is a history of early capitalist trading practices in North America in the 17th and 18th centuries. And so that's another form that public history can take when academics like Dr. Hart come to public spaces and discuss their work in a way that is meant to appeal to a broader audience and not just to other academics. A third way that you can see here, and this corresponds to the image on the top right, is curating historical sites. And so what the image on the top right is a monument to Thomas Paine, who I think you know by now had a connection to New Rochelle. The cottage I just mentioned is the space in which he lived near the end of his life, between 1803 and 1809. Near the cottage, also on North Avenue, actually a little bit closer to the Iona campus than even the Thomas Paine Cottage, is a monument commemorating Thomas Paine. And if you walk up North Avenue and you get to Sicard Avenue, you can see the monument. There's a very small image of it there, but curating historical sites, presenting, in this case, past major figures of American history like Thomas Paine is another way in which public history can operate. But again, public history, broadly defined, is any method of taking historical knowledge and repackaging it, or packaging it for the first time, to explain significant past events to modern day audiences. And so you encounter public history, if you think about it, almost every day. Certainly when one walks around New Rochelle, or when one walks around, for example, New York City, which is where I live, or Brooklyn more specifically, which is where I live, I find myself walking by examples of public history almost every day. Old buildings with plaques on them explaining the history of that particular building, or walking by statues, for example. And the example of statues, we saw the Thomas Paine bust on the monument to him. is the transition for the next slide that I want to discuss in the first historical commemorative topic that I think has a direct impact on the way that we view our own world today, is the Confederate monument controversy. So if you don't mind, please scroll down to the second slide, which is entitled The Confederate Monument Controversy. And this controversy brings up what I believe to be the most important central questions of what it means to practice public history, because it asks us to think about both the theory but also the practice of commemoration. And so I really want us to think about the question that is asked on the first bullet point, because it's very important for reasons that I think are deeper than a superficial, this is a statue that is made of this person. And it is, as you can read, who is commemorated and why are they commemorated? And so first of all, what is commemoration? It is, again, related to public history in that it's the presentation of past events for modern day audiences. The Confederate monuments controversy, I think as many of you know, is the most important modern day example of commemoration because it touches on not just the history of the American Civil War, right, which raged from 1861 to 1865, over the divisive and ultimately uncompromisable, if I can, issue of slavery. And just for a little bit of background about the Confederate monuments themselves, before I get into answering the question of who's commemorated and why, and then discussing a little bit further some of the issues that have emerged from this controversy. The American Civil War ended, if you're not familiar, I'll just do this quickly, in 1865. It was a war that was caused by to me personally, and I think to many other historians, the most significant political, social, cultural, and economic conflict of American history, which is that of the institution of slavery versus freedom between the Confederate States of America, which seceded from the United States beginning in December of 1860, and then waged war on the Union, the free states of the North. And this is a war, I'm sure that you're familiar with it to a pretty significant degree at this point, which pivoted on the central issue of slavery, but which resulted in the emancipation of ultimately 4 million slaves, the entire enslaved population of the United States. And that was culminated in the 13th Amendment, which was passed by the United States Congress in December of 1865. The war itself ended in 1865, and while that is the official end of the war, the political and social significance of the war persisted through a period called Reconstruction, which typically is dated by historians from 1865, the end of the war itself, until 1877. There was a massive transformation of society in the former Confederate States, what today we call the American South. This did not result in a racially egalitarian society. Certainly racial discrimination was and in many ways continues to be a hallmark of social relations in the American South, if not the entire country. But what began to happen by the end of the 19th century and moving into the first decade of the 20th century is that white Southerners began to think about the Civil War, a war which was lost by white Southerners who supported the Confederacy, and began to reframe it through commemoration in a way that resulted in an emphasis on heritage, which is a word that you see in the third bullet point there. They began to frame the project of the Confederate States of America, the defeated infant nation state from the Civil War, as a nation that was created not to protect the institution of slavery, which was in fact the reason that it was created, and we know that from reading the statements, the speeches, the writings of the Confederate leaders themselves, made it very clear that they created the Confederate States of America to protect slavery. But the next generation of Southerners began to reframe that as not the heritage of protecting slavery, but the heritage of protecting states' rights from an encroaching, interfering national government. And so this brought up, first of all, several key questions about why the Civil War happened to begin with. The answers that white Southerners began to craft to these questions, why did the Civil War happen, ultimately began to bleed into, over the period of the first half of the 20th century, into school textbooks that children and in colleges, young adults across the nation read and used to understand the massive transformation of the Civil War. So the Civil War became a war of heritage, not necessarily the memory of the emancipation of slaves. The commemorative practices that white Southerners began to develop, most importantly centered around creating monuments of Confederate heroes, typically military heroes, including some names that may be familiar to you: General Robert E. Lee, the chief commanding general of the Confederate Army. Others who might be familiar to you: General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, another famous Confederate general. But creating statues of these men in the context of the Confederate monuments, they were almost always men, to be clear. Displaying them in public spaces, in public squares in southern cities like Charleston, South Carolina, for example, or New Orleans, Louisiana, as a way of remembering the Civil War as a war to preserve the heritage and the memory of what early 20th century white Southerners believed the war to be about. Interestingly, in textbooks from the early 20th century, all the way through World War II, the 1940s, and even into the 1950s, one could read both scholarly books, but also middle school, high school, and even college textbooks which discuss the Civil War. And the true reason behind why the Civil War happened, which was an irreconcilable conflict over slavery, does not appear in these accounts. Now imagine that, reading a history, either a textbook chapter or an entire 600-page book about the Civil War, that either purposefully, usually purposefully ignored the fact that chattel slavery and white racism towards African Americans and people of color was not the reason why the Civil War happened. And so these choices, choosing to create statues, to make and display statues of people like Robert E. Lee and Thomas Stonewall Jackson, just to name two figures, began to reflect not necessarily the history of the Civil War itself, but the way that, in this case, white Southerners viewed their own society in the first half of the 20th century. As you, I think, are likely familiar, the history of race relations in the former Confederate states, but also even in the northern states, in New England, for example, in New York, in the Midwest, states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, was defined by racial segregation and the denial of civil rights by white authorities, denial of civil rights for African Americans by white authorities. So the social and political consequences of commemorative choices, who do we commemorate and why do we commemorate them, which is a point that I make in the speech that you read, says in many ways less about the history of an event that's being commemorated than it does about the modern time period in which these commemorative choices are being made. And this bled, as I think you know, or persisted all the way to the last few years. And if you are a little bit unfamiliar, there's a movement that really began to arise and escalate in and around 2016 into 2017 that was closely connected to the Black Lives Matter movement concerning police brutality, but which was a movement by activists to remove Confederate statues. And so you can see an image, the one image on this slide called the Confederate Monument Controversy, which is an image of a Confederate statue that is in the process of being removed. The argument by activists, social justice activists in particular, was that allowing statues of Confederate heroes, if you will, again, generals like Robert E. Lee and Thomas Stonewall Jackson, or statues of the President of the Confederate States of America, a man named Jefferson Davis, that to allow these monuments, these commemorative pieces, these material objects of commemoration to continue to be displayed in public spaces was to allow and to acknowledge a deep history of systematic racial discrimination. And so there were activist movements to remove these monuments. But it brought up an interesting question, and one that I don't necessarily have an answer to myself, but it's one that I'll ask you to think about, and it may be a part of your discussion board today, is how to deal with symbols of systematic racial oppression. Should they be preserved? Should they be simply removed from, for example, the central squares of towns like Charleston, South Carolina, removed but preserved and set aside? Should they be torn down? Should they be destroyed? And as you can see in the image that I provided on the screen, this statue is in the middle of being both removed, torn down, and ultimately being destroyed, being melted down. So these are really important questions about how we think about commemoration and why it's significant. And so now for the last portion, for about the last 10 minutes or so, I'm going to ask you to switch to the third slide, which provides some context for the speech that you read of mine. And again, thank you for reading it, about Brooklyn Battle Week, which you can see as the title of the slide. So a little bit of background about the Battle of Brooklyn, and then we'll get into the ways in which this battle is commemorated and remembered today in 2019, 2020, and then 2021 and moving forward. So the Battle of Brooklyn was a very important but often overlooked battle in the early stages of the American War for Independence during the American Revolution. So this battle was fought in August of, as you can see, of 1776. It was a battle which both ultimately resulted in the British Empire capturing New York City. So in one sense, it was a loss for the American patriot movement, the movement fighting for the independence of the United States. But it was also, in a way, a victory for the American rebels. So in short, what occurred was that after the first battles of the American Revolution, which occurred just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, the British Army's strategy shifted to trying to capture New York City. At the time, and still today, of course, the major economic hub of the eastern seaboard of the United States. And so what happened is that in late June and July of 1776, the British Empire began to mobilize its army, its infantry, its cavalry, and its naval resources from Boston to New York Harbor. And by late July of 1776, only a few weeks after the Declaration of Independence was made public by the Continental Congress of the Patriot Movement, the Revolutionary Movement, the British Empire had stationed more than 20,000 troops in and around southern Brooklyn. And so today those neighborhoods would be Gravesend, if you're familiar, which is close to the Rockaways, right on the New York Harbor, and began to slowly creep towards New York City, moving northward towards Manhattan. In August of 1776, late August of 1776, this invasion of New York City broke into open battle, where a Patriot Army commanded by George Washington attempted to prevent the British Empire from capturing both Brooklyn but also Manhattan. And so in August of 1776, a massive British invasion occurred, text message, and George Washington's troops valiantly attempted to prevent this invasion from being successful. A battle, the center of the battle happened in Brooklyn neighborhoods that are now called Park Slope and Brooklyn Heights. And in the short term, the American army under George Washington was unsuccessful. It lost the battle, to put it simply, but it was successful in that it prevented the British Army's capture of New York City long enough that the army commanded by George Washington was able to escape and rush northwards, first to Manhattan and ultimately up to Harlem and even into Westchester County. So the battle was a loss for the American army, but it ended up being a long-term victory. George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, his second in command, who I know Dr. Slimsky has, I'm sure, mentioned to you, were able to save the American army from being destroyed. And subsequently then, as I said, the army escaped northward to Westchester, and then ultimately by the end of 1776, marched southwards to Philadelphia, where the American Revolution continued for the next several years. So this battle was, as I said, a significant turning point in the American Revolution, and it is today commemorated through a series of 10 days of activities that commemorate the battle. In 2019, this was co-sponsored, as you can see, by the ITPS, and the two organizations that operate this commemoration, as you can see on the right, there's a list of events, and I know you can't read the text, but you can see at the top left that an organization called the Old Stone House is at the forefront of this commemoration. The Old Stone House, which is in the neighborhood that I've just referred to, Park Slope in Brooklyn, is in fact an old stone house. It is a house that was built in the middle of the 18th century that was used by George Washington as a headquarters briefly during the Battle of Brooklyn. And it's still there. It's in the middle of a really nice neighborhood park today that's called Washington Park, named for George Washington. And this historical site, the Old Stone House, takes the lead in commemorating the Battle of Brooklyn, and the leadership of the Old Stone House comes up with every year a fantastic schedule of events and activities that aren't just purely historical, but which take many different forms, and they're designed to engage broad public audiences and bring them to spaces like the Old Stone House, and where the battle and battle commemoration, and in fact a reenactment of the battle occur, which is in a large cemetery called Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. About 20 blocks to the south of the Old Stone House, so all within walking distance of each other, where the battle is commemorated and people like me give speeches, which you've read, as I said, where the battle is reenacted, where men and women dress up in the uniforms of 18th century soldiers, use 18th century weapons, firing blanks, but they do fire shots, so that modern day audiences can get a sense of what it would have been like to be in a battle in the year 1776. But it's more than just battle commemoration and reenactment. And I know the text is small on the image to the right, but just to give you a flavor of other sorts of activities that encompass Brooklyn Battle Week, there are historical tours, in this case, of Brooklyn neighborhoods. So tour guides lead groups of interested folks and point out places where not just the Battle of Brooklyn happened, key sites in this battle, but also give people a sense of the longer history of the neighborhood. So these historical tours point out key significant architectural sites from not just the American Revolution, but from the 19th century. The Old Stone House and Greenwood Cemetery also curated art exhibits which touch on ideas of the American Revolution, but which aren't just paintings, for example, of the Battle of Brooklyn, but take modern modernist art forms, modernist painting, modernist sculpture, with the general idea that they commemorate war, conflict, and social change. There are musical performances that were part of this 10-day slate of activities at the Battle of Brooklyn, and speeches, of course. But the point of bringing up the Old Stone House and Brooklyn Battle Week is just to suggest to you that historical commemoration doesn't necessarily need to feel stodgy and only rooted in the past, but that the ways in which we remember and commemorate historical events can also reflect our own times. And I think that's the key point that I want to leave you with, to go back to the very beginning of the talk, which is that public history and commemoration, as the act of bringing historical knowledge to public places, certainly touches on past events, but I think in a much more, to me at least, significant way, in a much more sort of immediate way, really shows us now, or allows us to see how we view ourselves more than we view past events, but that past events are a lens through which we can understand our own society. And so I'll stop there. And I want to thank you for listening, and I want to thank you for reading the speech that I wrote, which I think touches on the themes that I've discussed briefly here. I also want to thank Dr. Slanimsky for inviting me to give this video lecture. And I do want to close by, again, wishing you all the best health, and hoping that you are taking the precautions that we all are in order to keep us all safe. So be well, and I hope to see you on the Iona campus in the fall. Thank you.